There are huge potential gains in moving, both internally and especially internationally. This is even more true in developing countries. But why then are most people not moving? This is exactly what we'll be discussing in today's video. Hi, my name is Melissa Siegel. I'm a professor of migration studies, and this is a channel about all things migration. So today we are going to talk about why people don't move and why they don't move when migration could be very beneficial to them. Now, today's video is based on an article that came out by David McKenzie in 2022 called Fears and Tears, Should More People Be Moving Within and From Developing Countries, and What Stops This Movement? Now, this was published as a policy research working paper of the World Bank, and I'll make sure to link it down in the description below. But let's get right into it. So, why do we see so few people migrating when there are such large potentials for migration and there can be such large gains to migration? Why does it even matter if people migrate or not? Well, the first reason is that the allocation of labor, so in this case, people, specifically people that do labor, from more remote and unproductive areas, especially rural areas, towards urban areas has been a fundamental feature of the development process all around the world. There is a strong and negative association between the percentage of people living in rural areas and the GDP per capita of that country. So understanding why people don't move to urban areas is important for understanding kind of the constraints to growth and development around the world. And additionally, understanding why people don't migrate can help to clarify the reasons, of course, why people don't move, which can then be addressed by policies, especially if we're in a situation today where some countries would like to attract more talent, would like to attract the best and brightest around the world, and when in many countries around the world today, we see labor shortages in certain areas. So now, what are some of the potential benefits of migration? So there is the possibility for huge potential gains of migration for migrants and their families. For example, like increased income and living standards, as well as better working conditions and more access to services, just to name a few. So how then can we explain the fact that most people in the world do not migrate? As I mentioned before, only 3.5% of the world's population are actually international migrants today. Let's talk about 6 main reasons why people don't migrate today. So the first reason is a very simple cost-benefit calculation. If the expected costs outweigh the expected benefits of migration, then people won't migrate. So there are a wide range of monetary and non-monetary costs that can exceed the benefits of migration. Now, there is also an important time component here. So impatience and time scales or time horizons can play an important role here. So the costs of moving are immediate. You know right now exactly how much it's going to cost you to migrate, and you see that up front. But the benefits of migration can take time to materialize. So here, of course, patience is important and can play a role. So more quote unquote patient individuals are more likely to migrate. However, it does seem unlikely that impatience is the main driver of non-migration. So the next reason why we see that people don't migrate is incorrect information or incorrect expectations here. So people are sometimes making the wrong decision not to move. So misinformation and unrealistic expectations affect a person's decision to migrate. Sometimes we see that a person can be overly optimistic, which then induces migration, but people can also be too pessimistic, which leads to not migrating. Third, we have what are called liquidity constraints. So what do liquidity constraints mean? So people would like to move, but can't afford the cost of moving. they have budget constraints, and basically poor individuals often cannot afford to migrate. So here the costs are bigger than the benefits because it's not even possible to migrate, even though it would be beneficial for them to migrate in the long run. Basically, they can't afford the initial costs of migration. Now, the fourth is that there are often explicit policy barriers that directly limit migration. So we see limits on legal migration channels like quotas on migration or mandatory labor market tests or policies aimed at discouraging internal, rural, or urban migration, and many more. These are just some examples. However, the power of policies in limiting migration should also not be overstated. So, although information, liquidity constraints, and migration costs are important reasons for people not to migrate, there are other important constraints for people to not migrate, and these we can call fears and tiers. So here, fears have to do with the enormous uncertainty associated with migration, and that is difficult to quantify. So the sixth area that we can talk about are quote-unquote tiers. So in addition to the fears that I just spoke about of uncertainty, there are mental or psychological costs of moving. So the psychic costs of migration are related to a person's attachment to their place or leaving familiar surroundings or leaving family or friends. So let's dig a little bit more into this psychological side of decision making and why we see what we see today, which is a bias for the status quo or a bias for not moving. First is regret avoidance, which refers to a stronger feeling of regret for bad outcomes that are consequences of new actions taken than for similar bad consequences resulting from inaction or the status quo. So the second is loss aversion. So what does loss aversion mean? That is when people weigh potential losses heavier than potential gains. And the third is what is called ambiguity aversion. So that is when people prefer taking a known, so the status quo, taking what they know over what is a unknown risk, or in this case, migrating. So people prefer sticking with what they consider a less risky situation, which is then not migrating. A further psychological explanation for not moving is the difficulty to imagine what a person actually misses or what they give up by not moving. It is simply unknown what you will miss when you stay, and then it's easier to choose to stay because, of course, you don't know what you're missing. So this is called opportunity cost neglect. So these are our fancy terms to describe some of the things that we see. So a final sort of fancy term for why we see what we see is called the end of history illusion. So this means that individuals are aware of how much they have changed in the past, but they believe that they will change very little in the future. So people don't actually recognize how much migrating can possibly change their lives and their attachments to a place. So finally, we know that migration is potentially very beneficial to a lot of people across the globe, but most people decide not to move or not to migrate. So in this video, we've talked about how this paradox can be explained. So we looked at reasons for people to not migrate that include information failures or with regard to misinformation or a lack of information, liquidity constraints, high costs of migration, policy barriers, risks, fears, and tiers. And the fears we saw were about the uncertainty involved in migrating that can inhibit the movement in the first place, especially when many of the factors people are uncertain about may be difficult to quantify. And of course, therefore, difficult to also insure against in the future. So what we saw with tiers is that tiers that accompany migration reveal people's emotional attachment to a particular place. However, the status quo bias and the inability to picture or imagine one's future after having migrated may cause an excessive attachment to their current location. So there you have it. That's why people don't migrate. If you found this video useful, please feel free to share it around and write something in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the videos that we upload on different migration issues. And I do hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.